The 7th century Anglo-Saxon state extended its reach beyond the living. Political authority dictated the geographic placement and physical orientation of every corpse in the kingdom. The ruling class utilized immense reserves of labor and gold to construct towering burial mounds. Meanwhile, those convicted of crimes were granted no resources, dumped into unmarked trenches to be systematically erased. Before the development of comprehensive written legal codes, power was expressed through spatial dynamics. The physical landscape served as a medium for communicating the strength of the monarchy. The state administration coordinated the disgrace of criminals at the extreme territorial margins, with the same precision used to consecrate elites at the geographic center. Early statecraft utilized these burials as engineered instruments of psychological warfare, using the disposal of human remains to map the exact limits of a king's jurisdiction. Archaeologists identify execution cemeteries as state-mandated geographic zones. Plotted along the kingdom's edges and ancient earthworks, these locations functioned as psychological barriers. By clustering execution sites at high-traffic entry points, the state presented a direct warning to internal and external threats. This geographic exclusion has a physical forensic counterpart, Deviant osteology. It is the study of remains that violate every social norm of the period. To measure the severity of this disgrace, we must first establish the baseline of state-sanctioned honor. Assessing Anglo-Saxon statecraft requires reading the landscape of the dead as a physical, political map. Sutton Hoo serves as the archetype of elite, centralized burial. These mounds were designed as visible landmarks of state legacy. Mound 1 is positioned to overlook the River Devon, projecting a clear signal of territorial ownership and the state's command over vital maritime trade routes. Hauling an E-foot oak ship up from the river and engineering a trench to contain it required a massive mobilization of state resources and labor. Within the burial, the body was laid in a supine, face-up position. This careful alignment signaled eternal rest and the preservation of the occupant's social stability. This gold purse lid, inlaid with garnet cloisonné, is part of a larger collection of high-status goods, sourced from as far as the eastern Mediterranean, signaling the state's global reach. The presence of this ceremonial helmet explicitly linked the deceased to martial and administrative authority, anchoring the dynasty's power in a permanent physical form. The physical scale of these mounds established a focal point for state identity, converting the central core into a visible claim that outlasted the living. In the isolated margins of the kingdom, the state created a different landscape. These execution cemeteries were stationed on desolate fringes, far from population centers. The administration chose to decentralize the violence of the state, ensuring that execution occurred in the wilderness rather than the community center. Executing and burying a criminal at the border permanently stripped their community identity, placing them literally outside the protection of the law. Travelers entering the kingdom encountered these remains first, marking the boundary where the king's absolute jurisdiction began. This geographic isolation turned the very borders of the kingdom into a physical manifestation of fear and compliance. Early Anglo-Saxon execution relied on bureaucratic isolation. These sentences were carried out in silence, separating state violence from the eyes of the community. The process involved the forced transport of the condemned individual from the settlement out into the freezing wilderness. The execution was characterized by a lack of ceremony or audience, focusing purely on the mechanical efficiency of the act. The gravediggers functioned as indifferent agents of the state, performing a mandatory civic duty with cold dispatch. They dug hasty, shallow trenches, creating a physical contrast to the deep, engineered graves of the elite. This mechanical process stripped away the individual's identity, reducing a former subject to a piece of state refuse. The primary forensic marker of the execution cemetery is the prone burial, the placement of the body face down in the trench. This posture was the direct inverse of the elite supine position. It was a deliberate denial of a peaceful resting posture, signaling permanent spiritual disgrace. Forensic evidence reveals wrists bound tightly behind the back, identifiable by the unnatural angle of the radius and ulna. Decapitation leaves distinct cut marks on the cervical vertebrae. Afterwards, gravediggers placed the severed head between the knees to finalize the disgrace. The repetition of these skeletal configurations across disparate sites reveals a set of standardized legal mandates encoded directly into the earth by state agents. The state engineered the physical geometry of the skeleton to ensure permanent social erasure and exclusion. The Anglo-Saxon administration enforced a spatial hierarchy of gold versus mud, ensuring the center and the edge remained distinct and irreconcilable. The burial of this intricate gold belt buckle served to anchor the state's power in the center. In the border graves, the state withheld every marker of wealth and identity. The elite burial centralized state identity, while the deviant burial was positioned to repel threats and mark the boundaries of the kingdom. Total administrative control was achieved by dictating the exact location and posture of every body in the earth. Over time, the timber gallows rotted and the shallow graves disappeared into the landscape, leaving only unmarked depressions. The physical erasure of the grave finalized the sentence of social exclusion. The invisible presence of these remains continued to function as a silent, structural warning buried in the geography of the kingdom. The architecture of Anglo-Saxon law was constructed through the calculated placement and posture of human remains, using the landscape itself to broadcast